Today's scripture is Luke 12:22-31. He said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour of your span of life? If then you are not able to do so small a thing as that, why do you worry about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you? You of little faith, and do not keep striving for what you are to eat and what you are to drink, and do not keep worrying, for it is the nations of the world that strive after all those things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, strive for his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well." This is the word of the Lord.
As I mentioned in the opening, this summer we moved, and the reason, of course, we needed to move is we needed to find a place that could accommodate this new family we were putting together, which was going to have 6 people in it, which is a lot of people. And so when we start to look for places, we started to describe to the real estate agent what it is that we were looking for. And she's like, "Oh, that's pretty common these days, as far as we wanted so many bedrooms and all this sort of stuff for everybody." And I'm like, "What do you, like, that's really common these days?" I mean, I haven't apparently shopped for a house for a while. So I actually got curious and went back and looked, and it turns out over the last 40 years or so, homes have gotten a lot bigger, if you haven't noticed. This was a little chart I found because the internet will tell you anything you wanted to know. But back in the 60s and 70s and stuff, a typical house ran about 1,500 to 1,600 square feet, which is about the first house I ever bought, was about that size. And today, the average size home being built today is over 1,000 square feet bigger. So our homes have been getting bigger for a long time. There was a little dip in 2008. Can't imagine what was going on then. Have a vague memory of something. But we immediately got right back on course, as you can tell. And you do kind of wonder, how far can this possibly go, right? I mean, but what's interesting is that this trend towards larger homes happened at the exact same time that 2 other things happened. One is families actually got smaller, right? And so back in the 60s and 70s, it was the average family size for people living together in a home was somewhere between 4 and 5. And today it's more closer to 3. So there's less people living in these houses that are getting increasingly bigger. And then you add one more thing on top of it, that is the trend that's happened really only kind of really grown up in the last 20 years. And in the last 20 years, while our homes have been getting progressively bigger, there's also this incredibly lucrative market now in self-storage. You may have noticed that there's a lot of self-storage places that have popped up over the last 10 years or so, and the numbers kind of bear that out. And of course, these places are getting built because they're getting filled. So we have increasingly larger homes with less people in them, and then we have an incredibly huge new market for storage outside of these new larger homes that apparently people are all living in. And you got to wonder, what are we doing with all of this space, right? And of course, the answer is obvious. We're not filling it with people, we're filling it with something, and what we're doing is we're filling it with stuff. We have more stuff in and around our lives now than human beings have ever had in the entire history of human beings. right? We have more access to stuff. We have more things, and that's true across the world. And of course, the United States sort of sits at the top of the pyramid as far as everybody else today. Our homes are bigger than pretty much any other first world country, and we have more stuff. We collect more things than pretty much anybody else does. So we can say that if you are sort of the average typical American today, you live with, have access to, and have purchased more things than anybody who has probably ever lived in history before you. Go us. We just love to be number one in all of the things. And we are. And I think there's a couple like obvious reasons for this, and some of them are good and some of them are not. But one of the things that we also can't escape is that we are also constantly being sold stuff, right? I mean, we live in a world, and we have for a long time, where any place and every place you can possibly stick an ad, somebody has stuck an ad there, right? We talked about billboards along the freeway a couple of Sundays ago. There was always a huge section in newspapers and magazines back in the day, and now, of course, today you can't spend any amount of time online without seeing an ad for something or other. And of course, as time goes on, these things get more and more sophisticated. It used to be that we all generally saw the same general ads on television that were basically targeted at everybody. And today we live in a place and a time where Facebook and YouTube and all these people are more than happy to serve you up the exact ad for the exact thing that you want at that moment. And you can't tell me they're not listening to us through our smartphones. I'm sorry. But we are inundated by opportunities to spend our money and fill our homes with things. And some of those things are good things. Some of those things bring us joy. Every morning when I get up, and I make myself an espresso in my espresso machine that I bought off a Facebook ad 2 years ago, I smile. And I say, this is a good thing I did for myself. I love myself enough to make my own espresso. That's not a bad thing. Having things that make our lives easier, having things that make our lives more efficient, having things that allow us to have fun with our friends and our family and to recreate, things that allow our children to learn better, whatever it is, stuff itself isn't actually the problem. When we start to use stuff, though, for other reasons, that's when we can get in trouble. Because in order to convince us to buy something, they first have to convince us that we're missing something. All of us already have a lot of things. And so the first thing that advertisers or anybody else has to do is convince you that somehow you're missing out on something. That you're somehow not adequate enough, that you're not important enough, that your life isn't good enough unless your car is this new and your TV is this big. And so first they have to convince us that we need something that we probably don't need, and then conveniently they tell us where we can buy it. That is really what this passage today from Jesus is about. He is not saying that having stuff is bad. He's not saying that we shouldn't ever worry about what we're going to eat or anything like that, or we shouldn't plan for the future or anything like that. That's not what he's saying. He is telling us, he is reminding us that the most important things about us have nothing to do with how big our homes are, how much stuff we have, where our last vacation was, or how new our car is. The most important thing about us is none of those things. The most important things about us is that we are God's beloved children. Now, to really understand this passage, you really need to first read the passage before it. And this is often the case in the Bible. Jesus builds on each other. He's continuing building on the story. So right before this story about the lilies of the field, he tells a story about a rich guy who had an unexpectedly big crop one year, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. So he decided to basically tear down his barns that he would stored all this stuff in and build bigger ones so that he could store all this extra stuff that he had. He basically went into the first century self-storage business all on his own. And Jesus complains about this guy because he is trying to store up things. He's trying to store up things, for the future. He's trying to store up things that basically he doesn't need. He's trying to store more than he could ever consume or use. And instead of using it in a way to bless and feed others, which no doubt there was some need around him, he says, you know what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep it. I'm going to hold on to it. And when I run out of space, I'm just going to go get more space for my more stuff. So Jesus tells that story, and then he tells the story about the ravens and the lilies. Now, this is one that comes up a lot, and consider the lilies or consider the ravens as shorthand for this whole passage. But unfortunately, it's also one that I think is often misunderstood. We can read this as Jesus basically giving people permission to be lazy, right? Just don't worry about it. Somebody will take care of it somewhere. Don't worry about it. Or Jesus is giving people permission to kind of have a laissez-faire view of the world and life and their responsibilities to it. I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about here at all. What he's reminding us of is that if the raven being a raven and the lily being a lily is enough, and they are ravens and lilies, how much more important is it for us to recognize that our most important thing is to be us? That the most important thing that we are to be about is to remember first and foremost that we are God's beloved children. Because if God ordered the world in such a way that the ravens have enough and the lilies have enough, surely there's enough for us as well. Oftentimes in life gives us the exact opposite of that message. The message that says that we are not enough on our own, that we are somehow inadequate, that we are somehow not special enough, smart enough, beautiful enough, intelligent enough, whatever the enough is. We live in a world that constantly wants to tell us that we are not whatever that is. Jesus is reminding his people, his disciples 2,000 years ago, and reminding us today that each and every one of us, as we sit here today, as inadequate as we may feel from time to time, is in fact enough. Because we've been made by God, in God's image, and we've been loved by God since before we were born, and we will be loved by God for our entire lives. One of my favorite authors is a guy named Neil Gaiman, and he doesn't write a lot, but what he writes I really enjoy. And he has written a lot, though, about his personal life and his own struggles with what is popularly known today as imposter syndrome, right? Neil, though, despite being an incredibly talented, amazing, New York Times best-selling author, talks about how he constantly finds himself feeling inadequate to everything everybody tells him about himself. And he talks about being invited to speak at conferences and do all these things with all these other people that he sees as really far more intelligent and far more important than he is, and he wonders why he's even been invited to be in that room. Some of us have experienced this. Some of us, maybe not in the same way, but have been wondered why it is that we've been included or asked to do something that we feel inadequate or unprepared to do. And in the modern world, we've given that a name. We call it imposter syndrome. That we feel like if somebody figures out that I actually don't know what I'm talking about, the world is going to end, or my world is going to end. And I will tell you, pastors who stand in front of congregations like this feel this all the time. Someday you're going to figure out that I'm kind of an idiot. Don't know when that's going to be, but I keep waiting for it. I've given you multiple opportunities to prove that it was true, and yet you persist. But this concept is given a name today, and we talk about it more openly today, but it's nothing new. We have felt with and people have dealt with this for a long time. And in the writing that Neil talks about his own experience with this, he talks about attending an event that actually had people from all sorts of different disciplines in it. And in the back of the room, he found himself talking to another one of the presenters at the event. And that presenter, who happened to share his first name, said he was looking around the room and said, I look around the room at all these smart, wonderful, intelligent, creative, and artistic people, and I wonder what in the world I'm doing here, and why on earth they want me here. That other person, that other Neil that he was talking to who said those things, was Neil Armstrong. I could tell Neil Armstrong why he was there. I wasn't alive when Neil Armstrong did what he did, but I heard about it, read about it in the history books, and can affirm, I think we can all understand why it is that the first person to land on the moon and walk on the moon would be somebody you'd want to have around at an event of extraordinary people. But Neil went on to say, he says, I look around at all these people and I think, what the heck am I doing here? These people all made amazing things. I just went where I was sent. Neil Armstrong's summary of going to the moon and doing all the things that it took to get there was, I just went where I was sent. And on one hand, that is true. And on the other hand, I don't know that there's really any other human being who was capable of doing what he did. Neil, if you look at Neil Armstrong's history and where he came from and everything that he had been through, the struggles that he'd come through and overcome, it's almost like his life was made to do what he did. And I don't know that anyone can argue that there's anyone else who could have done what Neil Armstrong did as well as he did it. And yet, at the end of the day, he really did just go where he was sent. Each one of us has been given a unique sense of gifts and graces by God. Each one of us comes to this place this morning with our own sets of experiences, our own sets of adversities that we have overcome, our own personal histories, our own strengths and our own weaknesses. We've all been uniquely, beautifully, and wonderfully made. We've all been cared for and loved by God throughout all the years of our lives, and each one of us is in a unique place today to do something and to be something in the world that nobody else in this room can be. Yes, in many ways, Neil Armstrong was a uniquely wonderful and gifted person, but that isn't to say that there aren't other uniquely wonderful and gifted people, and it's not to say that we all aren't. The lilies of the field are okay because they're okay being lilies. The ravens are okay and cared for because they're okay being ravens. They're not trying to be anything that they're not. I can't be Neil Armstrong. I wanted to be when I was a child. Didn't work out. I'm not going to be Neil Gaiman either, and I'm not going to write a New York Times bestseller, and that's okay. I have my unique set of experiences in life, experiences that led me to be in this place and at this time, and I do my best to offer what I can from it. You each have your own unique set of gifts and graces and history and all of those things, and you've been uniquely placed to do and be where you are. The story of the lilies of the field is not about being lazy or laissez-faire. The story of the lily of the field is about being okay with being you. Recognizing you are enough because God made you and God loves you, and you were made in God's image, and you are one of God's beloved children. And that the only question we should be asking ourselves is, where am I now? What might God be asking me to do now? And how can I take what's uniquely mine to go out in the world and love God and love neighbor and love myself more? Because that's what we are up to. We're not to hoard everything we have and all the gifts and graces. We are not supposed to spend our time pining to be somebody else or somewhere else than we are. We are instead to look and ask ourselves the most important question. Who has God made me to be? What has God been loving me into? And where is God calling me next? Amen.